Here. Happy Sunday. Welcome to our last Sunday of the month, July 30th. And our Sunday school class, The Age of the Patriarchs. Brother Clay, you had something.
The archaeologists, whether they were found or recovered.
What they have is unfortunately it was destroyed by destroyed by Babylon in 587 BC. Then second temple was made under Ezra and Zerubbabel in the time of restoration after the Babylonian captivity. And so that temple was destroyed by Rome in the year 70. And the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall that you see people praying at today, is part of the support for that temple, but everything else was kind of underneath that. But we know the blueprint, the layout. We know where in the dome of the mosque of the Dome of the Rock on the Muslim top there. We know where that is in relation to where the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant was. So we've got that all kind of mapped out. So we know. Yeah, but there's still excavating going on as different politics and bureaucracies are factors in that, and they're still digging under and still discovering different things as well. So it's an ongoing thing. Yeah, so fascinating stuff, and I love models that I've done because I'm one of those guys. I love visuals, but I'm not visionary. You can't say something to me and that gives me a picture in my head. I don't work that way, unfortunately. I love those people who do. Back, I don't know if you all remember, but years ago when we were going through the books of Moses in Sunday school and we got to the tabernacle, I actually brought a tape measure and had guys pull out and measure so we could see, okay, this is 30 feet long. Well, what's that look like? Let's, okay. Yeah. Thank you, Brother Travis and Brother Madrano. Let's see what we're talking about here. Help me give me a visual. But I love the models that show the beauty and the glory and the heart that was put into it. So fascinating stuff. So with that, for our Sunday school class, we are again in the Age of the Patriarchs. The Genesis chapter 50 is where we will be. We are in the time frame, Genesis 50. Yeah. We're in the time frame between the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. One has happened, one not yet. And we're seeing how it's a major time of shifting for the state of affairs in the world, and it will certainly be again from the time of the death of Joseph to the birth of Moses. So that's kind of what we're going to be seeing here. We got a few things to look at. So of course, the Bible is our authority, and we'll be looking at Genesis 50 here in a second. And we're getting some background and timelines from Egyptologist David Roll. So with that, let's see. Let's go ahead and start. Again, refreshing where we left off in Genesis 50. Let's pick it up in verse 18. Genesis 50, verse 18. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to keep many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So that is the condition of the Lord's people in Egypt during this time we're about to take a look at, when everything else changes in the world around them. They're in this time of comfort and peace and stability and growth, but not so much everywhere else. So we are at 1632 BC. We are in the Middle Bronze Age 2A. Over in China, we've got the new dynasty, the Shang dynasty, being led by their first emperor, who revolted against the last emperor of the last dynasty. So we've got Emperor Tang of the Shang dynasty here. And there's an artist rendering of him much later after the fact. Over in Egypt, we have a queen ruling as Pharaoh all by herself. Let's see. And that is Queen Neferusobek, or Sobekneferu, however we want to pronounce that, or whichever order we want to put it in. So she ruled for 1 year with her dad before her dad, Joseph Pharaoh Amenemhat III, died, and now she is by herself as Pharaoh of Egypt. Queen Neferusobek or Sobekneferu. I've seen it written both ways. And the Sobek again refers to the crocodile that they worship out of the Nile River. That was so important to them. Over in Assyria, so she's a 12th dynasty, Middle Kingdom. Over in Syria, the Old Kingdom there, we've got Naram-Sin as their king, possibly about this time. And there's a line drawing from the seal showing Naram-Sin being presented to the god Asher, for whom the nation is named. And then we've got over in Isin, we've got Enlil-Bani. And this is from his time frame. So this comes from the time frame after Joseph's death, after Jacob's death, but before Joseph's death. And over in Larsa, further south, we've got King Nur-Adad. And that's also, again, from the same time frame. And over in Babylon, which here, this will take us to a quick layout of the place. So over in Babylon here, Babylon's right here, not too far from Kish. In Babylon, we've got King Sumu-la-el. We've got Babylon here, Isin here, Larsa here, and Tower of Babel, Eridu, Uruk, all that stuff down there in the Persian Gulf, which is Shinar, Sumer, Mesopotamia, land between the two rivers, all that stuff. And then over on the Mediterranean coast, just north and above the promised land of Canaan, we've got the city-state of Byblos, which is currently being led by their king, Ibshi-Mu'abi. So there they are up here. Byblos right next to modern Beirut in modern Lebanon. And here's the promised land right here. So that's what's happening. So Jacob has died. Jacob, also known as Israel. So it occurred to me that with the loss of Israel, his children are now Israelite. Yeah, I couldn't pass that one up. So at 1632 BC, Judah is 72 years old. Joseph is now 69. Judah's son Perez is 42. Perez's son Hezron about 29. And again, Judah, Perez, and Hezron are in the line of Christ. So 1632, Queen Neferusobek, Sobekneferu, Queen Pharaoh, she dies without an heir. And this pretty much ends the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Now, there's some different thoughts on where these next few kings, before there's pharaohs, before there's a really solid pharaoh, do we consider this the start of the 13th dynasty, or that really solid pharaoh the start of the 13th dynasty? Either way, 13th dynasty is a mess. And we are no longer in that high point Middle Kingdom. We're now in that intermediate period. Now it's the second intermediate period because there was a first one after the Old Kingdom that had its pyramids and all that stuff. And between that and the Middle Kingdom that Joseph was in, now that Middle Kingdom has ended, now we're in another intermediate period before we get to the New Kingdom. New Kingdom is where Ramses is and all those others. So this second intermediate period lasts about 450 years. So it's a big deal. And so from about 1632 to 1181 BC. This 13th dynasty here in Egypt, this is an era of short-reigned kings. Many of them come from the land of Canaan and have that in their bloodline. And the government is just politically unstable. It's an interesting time. And so when we do our astro retro calculation, we take the speed of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, we wind it back, and we line it up with different things, documents from those time and their observations. We see, yep, this fits right in. This would be the timing for the 13th dynasty that we're looking at here in these 1600s. And as they're digging at Avaris in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, you start at the top, so that's layer A, B, C, D. The further down you go in the alphabet, the older you go. So as we're moving up in time, we're moving up the alphabet. This is now layer or stratum H for anyone who cares at that area. From H going into G, G4, I know, exciting stuff. Let me share this, which was kind of funny, as interesting anyway. So as we're looking at this time in the Genesis chapter 50, between the death of Jacob, and then before we start with the next verses about the death of Joseph, these changes that happen, we're going to go through a parade of names and dates. So sit back, relax, don't sweat it, don't try to focus and remember all these names or all these dates. It's not so much the names and dates that's mattering, it's the shifting, the changing. So we're kind of just taking an easy breeze through this rotation of rulers and seeing some of the things that happen, how the world is changing around the Lord's people who are staying constant. But they also had an impact on this, especially in Egypt. So here's what I thought was kind of interesting. So David Rohl, amongst his other books, he has this book called Exodus, Myth or History. He wrote this after his involvement in the first Patterns of Evidence movie. What's funny is I pretty much respectfully completely disagree with him on the route of the Exodus. And but something he says here is very, very interesting in relation to this 13th dynasty and Joseph and Joseph's kids. And I'll share more as we go along, but just listen to this. It has long been argued that the extremely short reigns of these early 13th dynasty rulers was due in no small part to the power of the viziers at this time. That was Joseph's title. He was the vizier, the number 2 guy under Pharaoh. These were administrators, along with other high court officials. These were people that literally chose who was to be the next king. And they dismissed failing pharaohs pretty much at will. In the context of this model that we're looking at here, lining things up, it was the vizier Joseph, known as Anku, known as Anea, and his 2 successor sons, Manasseh, whose Egyptian name was Resheneb, and Ephraim, whose Egyptian name was Emiru. These were the guys who wielded power and control over a succession of ineffective monarchs. In doing so, whether intentionally or not, they weakened the native Egyptian kingdom, allowing the Semitic population to multiply and prosper following the demise of the 12th dynasty. So that was kind of interesting. It says here too, just one quick sentence here, the mixed Israelite Egyptian family of Joseph, remember, he married Asenath, who was Egyptian. She was the daughter of the priest Potiphar at Heliopolis. So this mixed Israelite and Egyptian family had become the real power brokers behind the throne. And the situation pertained throughout the remainder of Joseph Anku's life and during the vizierships of his sons. Between them, they chose and controlled a series of 22 short-reign pharaohs spanning as much as 80 years. So more on that later on. But so here we have a biblical explanation for what we're seeing in Egypt. The pharaohs are weaker. God's people through Joseph and his family are the strong ones, and they're the ones growing and prospering while Egypt is struggling to figure themselves out. So starting our parade through here, 1632, after the death of female pharaoh Neferusobek, Sobekneferu, we have our next guy up on the block here. We have there we go, Pharaoh Wegaf. And there is an altar from Wegaf, where we have discovered that. And again, these are short reign kings. This guy, 1632 to 1629, just a couple of years as pharaoh. Don't know much about him. But we do know is that kind of during his time, remember, it was those high flood levels of the Nile that first caused the years of plenty and then the years of famine because they got real high. Well, as Joseph, under his pharaoh, was able to do some hydraulic planning and engineering and divert a lot of that, they still had high flood levels, but now they were able to recover from that and plan for that. So now, by his time, these extra flood levels are continuing, and then it peaks about at 62 feet high, and then it starts coming down and coming down from there. So things are settling out. Over in China, we have a new emperor, Wai Bing or Bu Bing. He's the second king of the Shang dynasty, succeeds his father, Tang. and following the earlier death of his older brother, Tai Ding. So Tai Ding died and missed out on being the emperor. So now we have Emperor Y Bing. And his capital, they're keeping over at Yanxi.
Why the stems are so short? Are they raining? Is it because they die, right?
In the case of Egypt, not necessarily. The viziers sometimes dismiss the pharaohs, kind of like being impeached.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's how much power Joseph and his family had as viziers. And these pharaohs didn't have the strong family lines that we had with Joseph's pharaoh and his dad. So over here in Yanxi is where Y Bing is ruling. And here's kind of a refresher of some of the stuff, just to give us a break from yellow stone and dirt. In the former Xia capital, this is China, absolutely correct. They're excavating this old site. And there's the museum you can tour for this ancient society of China. Yeah, for some strange reason, all these different places are different capitals they've had. They've kind of hopped around. Basically, I don't know if it's a case of like rearranging the furniture. Hey, I'm in charge now, so I'm going to have my office over here. I'm not going to inherit the, I'm just, because if I inherit his old office, I'm just where he was. No, I'm going to make it my own by moving the cap, whatever. So the Yanxi, also known as Bo, is the capital here for a while for the Shang dynasty.
Don't steal the China.
Don't steal the China. That's right.
That's right. Don't touch the China.
And don't let the bulls in the China shop. Yes. So that brings us back to Egypt, because Wegaf was not pharaoh for very long. So now in 1629, we have another, here's a fun one. Sekhemre, Khutawy, Sobekhotep, or Sekhemre Amenemhat-Senebef. Yeah. Yeah, you know. So there's the head of a statue that's thought to be this guy. Was there anything else of any?
Cool.
Yeah, where do you think they got it? What's interesting is just like we have north and south, so did Egypt, only it was upper in the north and lower in the south because of the direction of the Nile River going from south to the north. And so with the cone heads, basically there are different crowns for the different halves of Egypt. And the unified pharaohs who unified them both, they wore both crowns, and the crowns fit actually over on top of each other, and they fit together. And so you're the crown, you're the pharaoh of United Egypt when you wore both the crowns of the upper and lower Egypt. I forget which is which offhand, but the white crown is the cone head one. Yeah. So there's stuff. Yeah. So we get the idea here. Howdy, howdy. Welcome, welcome. So that's this new pharaoh, Sekhemre, Khutawy, Sobekhotep. Yeah. And he reigned from their capital that they've had for a little while here. This is where Joseph's pharaoh's capital was, Ichitawi, which is kind of a weird thing to say. Yeah. Reminds me of a King of the Hill episode with Itchy Algae, but Ichitawi, right here along the Nile. That's where Joseph hopped around. There's the pyramid of Amenemhat I, Senuseret I, and all those from this middle kingdom here. So you've got there you've got the big pyramids from the old kingdom. Here's where Joseph diverted the Nile water over here, the waterway of Joseph and all that stuff. So that's kind of where the capital is. So Joseph would move back and forth between being with the Lord's people up here in Goshen at Avaris, down here at the Egyptian capital at Ichitawi, and then over here in the Fayum Basin with the waterworks and all that stuff. So there's that. So in fact, it's about this time, 1628 BC, the flood peaks are further reduced to 39 feet. And that's pretty much what the standard was. It would overflow about that much. And so this is when they stopped taking the records. And it's kind of interesting how they started all of a sudden, then they stopped all of a sudden, because all of a sudden became a need, and then it became no longer a need. And so we see that playing out. So this was the last times the Nile flood levels were documented there. This actually brings us to a birth in the Bible genealogy. So you might be saying, come on, Eric, when are we going to get back to the Bible? Okay, let's go back to the Bible. It's a genealogy. Oh, I guess I should have been more specific. First Chronicles chapter 7:24, one verse. This birth is in the line of Joseph. So Joseph, one of his sons, Ephraim has a son named Resheph, and Resheph has a son now named Beriah. So in First Chronicles 7:24, and this is in the lineage from Joseph to Joshua. So these are Joshua's ancestors here. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. That's part of it. And it's also, what's kind of interesting about that is in the Judean culture, they actually trace the bloodline through the matriarchs, through the women, and that holds a high value. But yeah, as far as I think because it's the God's leadership here, because we're going from the leader Joseph to the leader Joshua. So we're validating Joshua by tracing his lineage back to Joseph. So I think that's what a lot of what you see here. Notice when it mentioned the 75 coming together in Egypt, it said in addition to the daughters. Right. So they weren't counted in that number, so they're actually more than that. So yeah, I think there are a couple of things. It's where the focus happened to be for the intended purposes. It's not that they mattered less. Of course, they're God-made human beings, just like everyone else. And where would we be without moms and wives, right? Yeah. And so there's that. But I think too, it's a case of limiting the Bible and those genealogies to those things, and rather than having it be more cumbersome. And so, yeah, but great question. So here we have First Chronicles 7. Samuel Kings, First Chronicles 7, verse 24, which tells us, along with this line coming down, his daughter was Shira, who built Lower and Upper Beth Horon, as well as Uzan Shira. So here's a female who did something. There we have it, yeah, along this line. And what's kind of fascinating to me, as I touched on the other week, how there are two different ways of looking at these. There, you can look at the generation number, or you can look at the years. And of course, I've got to see it kind of showing both. And what's interesting is the generation number, we're not all born around the same years. Loosely speaking, they were. But for example, my younger brother, Ryan, is 14 years younger than me. He's in my generation line, but he's only 7 years older than my daughter, Alyssa, who's in the next generation line. He is closer in years to my daughter's generation, but he's of my generation. So where you put him is depending on, are you going by years or are you going by generation line? And so too, we see that with the people of the Bible, as we see not only is the world changing around them, but as we know, the Lord's people are being fruitful and multiplying by God's design here. Some more rapidly than others. Some are having more kids, some are having fewer kids, some are having them quicker and having more generations faster than others. Some people say, well, if this line has this many generations and that line only has so many generations, then that genealogy is wrong. There are gaps in there. No, they just weren't as happy, or they just took their time in having their generations. That's how it happens in life. And so the Bible says what it says, and it says enough of what needs to be said to understand all that. But kind of important stuff to be aware of and keep in mind. So yeah, so there from this generation, there was the time that Joseph's fourth generation, Joseph, Ephraim, Beriah, and Resheph. So at the time of Resheph here, we've got this female. Here we have again Shira. Wasn't she in the He-Man and the Master? No, that's a different one. So Shira building Lower and Upper Beth Horon later on, and Uzan Shira. So yeah, so here we have a female who accomplished something during her time. So next up, 1627, we've got another new emperor in China. Zhong Ren is now the emperor of the Shang dynasty. He is the third Shang king, takes over from his father Tang and his older brother YB, and he keeps the capital there at Yanxi. So Tang had at least 3 sons. The first one died before becoming emperor. Second one became emperor. Then when he died, the third son became emperor. They're keeping it all in the family. Back over in our neck of the woods in Mesopotamia, we've got a new king over in Larsa in 1622 BC. This is 144. His name is Sin-Idinam. What do we got from his time frame? Let's take a look. We got stuff, a dedication tablet. His name is mentioned here. Let's see. For Utu, Lord of justice of heaven and earth, learned in decision, one who chooses in favor of innocence, the king and his king, Sin-Idinam, shepherd who decorates everything for Nippur, the provider of yada yada, king of Larsa. Again, Nippur was their Mount Olympus where they thought all their gods were assembled, so they kept fighting over control of Nippur. Yeah, so again, this is after the death of Jacob, before the death of Joseph. While they are staying true to the one true God, here we have all this pantheism going on and all these multiple gods and all these folks who, like China, are descendants of Noah. So it's kind of nice that the Lord's people are being somewhat isolated from all this pantheism, all this multiple God stuff going on around them. Again, everything we're seeing here comes from this time frame. So that's Sin-Iribam. Now, here's a fascinating story in China once again. Let me go back to that, gives something to look at while we're talking about China. Okay, so new emperor in China once again, 1623 BC. Now we've got Tai Jia. Well, so he's the fourth king. He takes over from his uncles, Wai Bing and Zhong Ren. So he keeps the capital there, Yanxi. But this guy, we've got some stuff on him. He treated his people badly. He broke his own laws. A few years into his reign, he saw some internal disorder in the court. The prime minister, Yi Yin, advised him to change his ways, but the headstrong king ignored the advice of the elder statesman. Story goes, eventually the prime minister had no other choice but to exile the king over to where the tomb was of Tang. So then Yi Yin kind of ruled the country for 3 years or so. Then he felt the king had sufficiently changed. He invited the king back to the capital to take over again. From that point on, the king took care of his people, managed the government well. So Yi Yin resigned from his post, retired, and honored the king. But there are some other records that tell a different story, that Yi Yin seized the throne, and then Tai Jia secretly returned and killed the prime minister. But they're saying that's probably not as likely, so interesting stuff there. So it's not just a palace intrigue over in our neck of the woods, it happens over even in the opposite ends of the world. So this brings us to the exciting line of Levi. Now remember, Moses comes from Levi. So Levi, again, I mentioned he's got 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And those are going to be the 3 divisions of the tribe of Levi. And each division is going to have their own special role when it comes to the tabernacle and the service of the things of the Lord. So Levi has a grandson born to Gershon, and that son is Jahath, 1622 BC, mentioned in 1 Chronicles 6:43. 1 Chronicles 6:43 tells us son of Jahath, son of Gershom, son of Levi. Sure enough, there you have it. So by the way, it looks like in that line from Joseph down to Joshua, it looks like they're fathering the next generation on an average of about at 20 years old. Here in this line, with Levi going down through his firstborn through Gershon, looks like that line, they're fathering the next generation at an average age of about 48 years old. So a bit longer, a bit slower. New king in Babylon, 1617 BC, named Sabium. He, like the others with him in these early days, was an Amorite. He was a Westerner who came to this area, and Babylon was kind of a breakaway from the others and was really small, and they still didn't really call themselves kings of Babylon because Babylon wasn't much yet, but these were the original rulers, and the city would continue to grow from there. In fact, it's going to be really big during the time of Moses. Babylon has a famous king, Hammurabi, however you want to say his name, who's very famous for his law code. Came out at the time. There are a lot of comparisons with his law code and the 10 Commandments. some major differences, which we'll get to when we get there. But so this is all leading up to the big explosion of the first real powerful dynasty there in Babylon. But these are those early days. So we get to see the start of it all. Now, things were bad for the Egyptians, but they're about to get even worse. 1617 BC. Egypt's political stability that Joseph, the Israelite vizier, had established during those famine years, their stability is just disintegrating. The king we last saw, the Pharaoh Sekhemkare Amenemhat-Senebef, gets assassinated. And the country is immediately plunged into anarchy. For 6 years, there's political infighting. So there's no pharaoh, no successor for 6 years. Egypt's referred to as the Black Land, and the outside of that's the Red Land. So the Black Land fragments into small little kingdoms, small little fiefdoms. No one ruler is singled out to be recognized as pharaoh of the whole thing by the priesthood out of Karnak. So we have what's called a fancy word, Interregnum, which means space between regnums, between reigners, between rulers. So from 1616 to 1611 BC, we have no pharaoh in Egypt at all. So a little bit of chaotic time there. 1616 BC, we got new king of Larsa, Sin-Iribam. 1615 BC, Levi's grandson Mushi is born to his son Merari. They're having kids about the age of 51 as they go down. This brings us to Isin. 145, yeah. So again, don't worry about the names and the dates so much, just kind of taking us on a stroll through these transitions and this time of unsettlement. So we've got Zambia, king of Isin. It says about him that the land of Elam and Zambia was defeated by Larsa later on. So there's a confederation between Isin and Elam on one side against Larsa on the other. Again, they're fighting over Nippur, their Mount Olympus for their gods. So Zambia may have survived the battle. Let's see. And we have one inscription from his time frame. Let's see. And that inscription reads, Zambia, the shepherd who reveres Nippur, the farmer who brings tall flaxen grain for Duranki, the true provider, who fills the courtyard of the Igalma with abundant things, king of Isin, king of the land of Sumer and Akkad, spouse chosen by the goddess Inanna, remember her from Wednesday nights, beloved of the god Enlil, the goddess Ninisina, built the great wall of Isin. The name of that wall is Zambia, the beloved of the goddess Ishtar. So all these different gods and goddesses they're worshiping as they're trying to make names for themselves and as they're fighting amongst each other. So, yeah. We have 1614 in Larsa, King Sin-Iddinam, son of Sin-Iribam. He seized a bunch of other cities, defeated Kalu, Elam, and Zambia. 1611, another emperor in China, Wu Di, took over from his father. And he honored the prime minister of before. So another reason to think, okay, that it wasn't a case of the prime minister being bad and having to get killed. 1611, and back in Isin, Iter-Pisha is king. He wrote he's got a letter that he received from one of his subjects that we have. And it's a petition from the subject who fell on hard times. It's 24 lines, and it's what's called a belle letter. This is a French word, which means pretty letter. This is a phrase for something that the substance really isn't much of anything, but it's just written really nice and pretty and fancy. So it's called a belle letter. So now you know that. Now we get to the big change in Egypt, where they finally get united under Pharaoh Amenemhat the Fifth in 1611 BC. He's a happy guy. So 1611 BC, after a protracted civil war, local ruler from the eastern delta seizes control, and he's crowned in Thebes as Sekhemkare Amenemhat the Fifth. During these troubled times and these remaining years of this 13th dynasty, the royal residence stays there at Khutawy, but with the coronation of Amenemhat here, the summer residence of the royal household gets reestablished at Avaris in Goshen, where the Israelites are. That used to be the summer residence for the pharaohs back in Abraham's day. When Abraham went to see Pharaoh Khutawy IV, it was there at Avaris where he was having his summer residence. So now that practice is back. So now Pharaoh's going back and hanging with the Lord's people up there.
Egypt? Is he Egyptian?
Yeah, this is Egypt. He's the new Pharaoh of Egypt. After Egypt went 6 years without a Pharaoh, now he was able to take advantage of the opportunity. Yeah, no worries.
Well, because his head was,
Yeah, it's kind of chopped off and we're missing the, yeah. Exactly, good observation. Yeah. So again, keep in mind during this time, these Asiatics, these people from Canaan, the Lord's people here, they'd flooded in during the Joseph era. And so Pharaoh's court begins to be dominated by officials and counselors from the Semites, from the Semitic speaking population, from the Israelites. The exceptional appointment of Joseph as the Asiatic vizier had set a precedent, which was eventually to bring instability and further internal conflict into the Nile Valley. Now, this guy, King Amenemhat V, was not directly of that 12th dynasty bloodline that died out. Although the new king was given a good Egyptian name at birth, he was of mixed descent. His mother was a member of Joseph's family. So it was common practice in Egypt for newborn males to be named after the reigning monarch. So this child of an Egyptian and an Israelite descent came into the world at the end of the long reign of Amenemhat III. So before Amenemhat III died, he was born and he took on that name. So yeah, so he's of mixed parentage, just like a lot of folks are that we're going to see here as we go. So by 1609 BC, creation, the planet, the earth is now 3,600 years old. If Adam were still alive at this point in time, hanging out with Joseph and the brothers, Adam would be 3,600 years old right now. So we got another king in Larsa named in 1609 BC named Sin-Idinam. He didn't even last a year. He was removed from the kingship and no longer king. So there's that. We've got, let's see. Yeah, again, very interesting time of instability. We've in Larsa, we've got War at Sin, and here's some stuff from his time frame. 1608 to 1597 BC, so a few years, but really don't have a lot of activity, just a lot of stuff made from his time frame. Yeah, go ahead. These are writing on them, so they're used in that way. They don't have books like we know them just yet. So what we have are, this is a foundation tablet from the temple that he dedicated. This is the figurine, of course. This is, as we see, that's a clay cylinder. And the text here mentions Sin, the king of Larsa. This is mud brick that's been stamped with the writing. So they had a stamp pre-made and then they stamped the mud brick while it was wet with that. And this is a foundation cone that they wrote on. So yeah, again, they didn't have the resources and raw materials that other places have. Not a lot of wood, not a lot of stone. So they used a lot of mud brick and clay tablets in Mesopotamia. So that's actually a good place to stop. We will pick up next week as we're getting ready for the death of Joseph. Joseph dies, spoiler alert, in 1591. We're now to the year 1608. So we are 9 plus 8, 17 years short of the death of Joseph. So we're almost there. So we'll be picking up in Genesis 15 next week and getting to the next new Pharaoh. So with that, any thoughts, questions, observations as we looked at this bit of a parade of names and dates, but again, seeing the shift in the world around them. And remember, God's behind the scenes of everything as he's preparing what's going to be next. But any other questions or thoughts on what we've looked at and considered this morning? All good? All righty, we'll call it a wrap for today. So we'll stop our share, stop our recording, and get ready for our praise and